Hello, and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Kiri Meyer.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, which is a social support network creating a community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever need to grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people in this field so we can normalize and educate the Heal Grief community. We are pleased to have Briana Megid for our show.
Thank you for having me.
So after the loss of Briana's boyfriend and 3 classmates in high school, she began her work with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Briana is the youngest member of AFSP's National Loss and Healing Council. Briana is working to bring more awareness to International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day to young adults nationwide.
So welcome again, Briana. We are so glad to have you with us today. So we know as we have actively moving forward here with us, we know that many millennials and Gen Zers are big advocates these days, which we absolutely love. There are so many different stigmas that are getting reduced. Hopefully will continue, and we think that's amazing. But as a young adult yourself, how do you think suicide fits into all of this? And do you think it is also being destigmatized as much as some other things are?
Sure. That's an awesome question. Suicide, I think, is a special kind of grief and issue in itself because a lot of loss has, and not to trivialize it, but has an explanation that people can kind of easily understand. With an illness, if there's an accident, you can kind of point at this was variable X and this is what happened. And I think what's tough about suicide, regardless of the age group, is there is no clean or easy answer. There are a lot of factors that go into every individual's experience, and that's what makes the grief process so hard, is you don't really usually get a why, and if you got a why, it might have been completely misconstrued by how that person was feeling at the time. So I think that as a young person, it's tough to have these conversations because not only is it just immensely uncomfortable, but it also doesn't have a conclusion or definition that we can grasp onto in conversation. And in my experience, I've been working and being an advocate for almost 10 years now. And I still have a really tough time having those conversations with my friends even. I believe in being an advocate 24/7. So if that means I'm the kind of awkward person who brings up my story with someone who doesn't know me that well, I see that as my duty to kind of open up that conversation, and that's my opportunity to reduce the stigma in that moment. And it still feels a little alien, and I still have one of those kind of societal checks where I'm like, oh, what will that person think of my story? How will they perceive who I am and how I act based off of this little tidbit that I gave them? And especially having lost my boyfriend, people are quick to think, oh, she has possibly some repercussions in her own love life or in dating. Like they overcomplicate things because they don't know me or because they have a perception of what suicide and depression is. So I think that there is a lot of positive momentum in that people are opening up these conversations, but there's still a lot to be done. And I think I'm a great testament to that, because if I'm still a little bit uncomfortable, it goes to show that there's still a stigma there. And I think that the best thing that we can do for both people who are currently struggling and those who are grieving is to make that stigma a little easier to deal with. Because I think not having those conversations is one of the most dangerous things we can do. Finding community, having conversations, reaching out to a person you're worried about are all things that are stifled if we feel like we can't have that conversation because the stigma is too overwhelming. So long story short, yes, we're making great strides. There's a lot to be done, but I think it's the most important tool that we have.
Well, and as you say about the importance of having these conversations, stigma itself is isolating, right?
Yes.
It already is an isolating thing, and then you add to it that no one's talking about it. I'm curious, though, in your conversations that you've had,
Sure.
Have you encountered people where, I know you may have encountered some people who are like, I don't even know what you're talking about, or scared to continue the conversation. or maybe everyone just gets quiet and it moves to a new subject. I don't know. But have there been conversations you've had where you were surprised by someone who was there, either identified with it or had their own story?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think one of the most rewarding and healing things for me is when the person I open up to goes, "Oh my God, I thought that was just me," or "that my mom passed a few months ago," or "yeah, that happened to my neighbor and I had no idea that this happened to other people too." Like, I think at such a young age, we don't really always spend the time thinking about that this can happen to us. We're kind of just trying to figure out life. I know that I didn't know suicide could happen, and that was something a young person could feel when my boyfriend took his own life. But those conversations where someone opened up and says, "Yeah, me too," are actually fairly numerous. I've found that one of the events I put on when I was still in college, which was a Survivor Day event, we basically put an ad out to all of our campus saying, if you want to show up, you can. We're going to have a day where anyone who has lost someone to suicide or has lived experience, just going to join together in a room, and here's an idea of our, the A to Z's and what we're going to do, but you're welcome to kind of check it out and see what you think. And these people, I was really impressed with them, came by themselves. It wasn't like a group of friends. It was all these people who came by themselves, and were sitting in these discussion groups. And the comments that we heard the most were, "I thought it was just me," or we had a group, oddly enough, that all shared the same kind of loss. And that was just like horrible but beautiful serendipity that they kind of were all paired together, despite having, dealt with something so horrible. But for them, and what was the most rewarding thing for me, was the fact that they left that day feeling like they had a network that they could reach out to now. That, this horrible thing that they're spending a lot of time by themselves processing is something that there are a lot of other apartments with different kids thinking about the same thing, that they can just pick up the phone and go find them. And they don't need to talk about it per se, but they can go get a coffee and go on a walk, and just be together. So I think that a lot of people hold back from sharing that story because they feel like they're going to be the odd one out. But in truth, it's pretty rewarding because a lot of people are affected in their own way. And more often than not, I think people are very receptive.
Yeah.
I would agree. So, something interesting that you said earlier that just kind of made me start thinking about some things that I've learned too, is that when you were in high school, you didn't really get the idea behind why suicide can happen. Like, you didn't really get it. And I know that I've talked to plenty of high schoolers who, you go in and you assume that everybody knows why suicide happens or can happen, and there's no education around it. And so then, as we're talking about them going into young adulthood and trying to, kind of transition to this next phase and have a support system, if we don't have a good understanding of it, a good base of it as we're younger, then there's even more stigma and even more issues as we're trying to come to terms with it later in life and as we have more experiences with it. So I guess my question to you is, like, who talked to you about this? Like, how did you finally really learn about all of this and in what it can look like and what it can feel like and things like that?
Sure. I that's a great one. I would say I'm just a very kind of fidgety person. So for me, after my loss, I kind of had a really reclusive, isolated routine of, I was 15 when I experienced my loss. I was go to school, do the thing I had to do, close the door of my bedroom, be by myself. And it was just on repeat. And that gets really old really fast. And it certainly doesn't make anything feel better. But about, I would say 6 months after my loss, I was sitting waiting for the bus because Lord knows I didn't have a license at the time. And there was an ad for a community walk by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I had no idea what those string of words meant, but it sounded like it was getting to what was bothering me every day. And so a group of friends and I went on this community walk on just a super gross, foggy Saturday morning with a bunch of people we never met. And it was like my first taste of what advocacy and community was like. It was, a bunch of people, different walks of life, completely different experiences, completely different stories of their grief, joining together, not necessarily discussing what it was that bothered them, but it was this completely different atmosphere where we kind of all knew why we were there. And it was a 5K. And so you're walking around and sometimes you'd kind of like bump into somebody and that would start a natural conversation. And you'd start a conversation with somebody who you don't know about the worst time in your life. And the way that they reacted is a way that only somebody who understands can. They're not saying like, oh, I'm so sorry, and then trying to give you a bunch of like bizarre tips and tricks. They're just listening. And so for me, that was intoxicating. I was like, I needed this 6 months ago, and I have no idea that this was there. So I want to create this environment for future me's and for my community and for my friends, because this seemed to be the only thing that worked for us. We were all trying our own tips and tricks and fast fixes, and nothing was helping. But having an outlet that was so carefully curated to be a safe place was what made everything better. So the work that I've done in the years following has been to create that atmosphere for other people who are just kind of, I always say, it's somebody who's at 2 a.m. Googling, how do I feel better? And they're not going to find it if we're not setting it up. So in my opinion, setting up those opportunities where when you're at your worst, you feel like, okay, this might be on a whim, but I'm going to go join this group of people, and to feel like warm and invited and understood and not pushed too much, but maybe pushed a little to start talking about what it is that bothers you. I think that was the experience that I had, and that's the experience I'm trying to replicate for everybody else. And Lord knows the process isn't perfect yet, but it's, I think, really, really important to do, and was pivotal for me in my experience.
So with the initiative that you're working on right now, what are some of the components to that? Are you guys looking at how you use social media, technology? What are some of the things that you're working on to try to engage with
Sure.
young adults nationwide?
Sure. I think a lot of people come into this work because of their own stories. So that goes to say that we all come into this line of work advocating for our very unique experience. And so a lot of my peers haven't shared the same experience with me at the same time of my life. So there haven't been a ton of opportunities and resources for young people. And what comes with that is this kind of like, this is an issue, it's over there, I'll deal with it when I get to it, but this is my priority right now. And I completely understand it, because that's exactly how I'm treating my work as well. Right. But I think that there's a misconception that young people are a different animal, that they need completely different set of resources. But in truth, we just need a different environment, in my belief. I don't think that we need a completely different structure. I just think we need to be in an environment with our peers. And that's tough to rally, because we're in a stage of life where we're just figuring it out, or we're in classes and we have a job, or we're volunteering or applying to something, or society has told us we need to prioritize all these levels of success before we can settle down and think about what might be best for our brains and our hearts. So I don't think that having a very innovative method is what we need. I think that we just need more events and opportunities that are, this is just for you. You're going to show up and everyone's going to sound, look, and understand you. And if you don't want to say anything at all, that's fine too. My biggest thing is to give both a journaling opportunity and also conversational opportunities, so that people don't feel polarized. I think in a young adult age group, there's a lot more tendency towards silence and isolation than there is to be communicative just yet, because a lot of people are like, even just naturally, their inclination is to be a little more reserved. So yes, social media to find these folks, but also journal. So if they don't really want to talk to you, they can at least take that time to address what these feelings are for themselves, by themselves, and still have opportunities to start those conversations with the peers around them. But that needs to happen with there being enough events to house these kinds of conversations. And that's where there really is a gap. And that's what the gap I'm really, really trying to fill, is just make sure that you late night Google, that event is near me. I can walk to it. I can take a bus to it. It's not something that I have to webcast from, a different country to access. So yes, I would say there are aspects to it that are unique to a young person, but nothing so overwhelming that we can't start focusing on it now.
And with the initiative, does it have to do with a bereavement focus, or is it a suicide prevention focus, or is it both? It's for those who are grieving the death of someone, suicide, but also then there's a suicide prevention component. Is it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I don't love the jargon, but I do think that prevention is postvention and postvention is prevention. I think that people who have lost someone to suicide are at higher risk themselves. So to give them the opportunity to discuss that which is hard for them and their own grief is an opportunity for us to prevent anything happening to these individuals themselves. Because the cycle is isolation, having these, unhealthy behavioral traits and all these factors overlaying on potentially undiagnosed mental health issues. If we're kind of starting to chip away at that and start an educational process in which people know how to identify that in their peers, you're starting, even though they're here to talk about what makes them sad or their loss or their lived experience, that's an opportunity to have a few more people educated on acknowledging the signs and acknowledging the signs in themselves and in others. Because for us, one of the resources we gave away the most was this little business card that says, these are the signs. Because people would come up to our tables and say, I don't really know what this looks like. I know that this is happening. I'm hearing about people passing away, but I'm kind of worried about my friend and I don't know, when I can jump in and say something. And so I think giving people that educational tool in itself is preventative, and is really important because it's not all that hard and it's not all that complex. There's just a gap in our education and letting people know these are the signs, this is what you can do.
I think that's a really important aspect because a lot of times what you can hear from people is we don't want to talk about suicide, even if it's educational, because that tells them how to do it. And that's really a huge misconception because the more they know, the more power they have to see it in themselves or to see it in someone else. They will then know, hopefully, the different resources they can go to as well. Instead of just being like, I don't know what's wrong with me, I don't know why I'm feeling this way, or I don't know what's going on with my friend and just ignoring it. This can really be, again, like you were talking about, we can be proactive, hopefully, even if it's postvention and we're working with bereavement, it really is being proactive and working on some prevention as well, hopefully. And that education doesn't mean that we're giving, tips and tricks on how to do this. We are giving them tips and tricks on how to take care of yourself and take care of other people. I think that's a huge aspect to this that I think is missed a lot of times.
Well, and I also think it's interesting how that you talked about the environment. We sometimes stay so focused on what we think people need to read or to hear someone say, as opposed to how do we create this space for people to be with each other and connect on that level. I'd love the opportunity of us having some more further conversations, just because being a facilitator, trainer for AFSP, I think there's some dialogue here around, there's a traditional model of and training people to facilitate those groups. And then there's these young adults who are coming up. The model's slightly different, a little bit. It really is about creating the space, and I think there's some dialogue to be had. So we only have a few minutes left, Briana, but I am wondering if you have any words of wisdom for anyone who's coping out there with the suicide of someone in their life. What you would have to say to them?
Sure. I was 15 when I lost my boyfriend, and I remember the hardest thing was shopping for a black dress for a funeral I didn't feel like I should be going to. I didn't know what suicide was. I didn't think it would happen to me, and I didn't think it was fair. And I was angry, and I certainly didn't feel like anyone could understand that. And so the biggest turning point for me was realizing that I wasn't alone. And that took being courageous and starting conversations I really didn't want to start having, and putting myself in environments that I didn't, it doesn't sound fun to go to a walk on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. When I'm 15, I'd rather be sleeping. But, it took a little bit of legwork, and it gave back so much. I happily am fulfilled doing this work. It's been 10 years because I want it to be 10 years. It's something that it took a little bit of initiative to put myself into conversations I didn't want to be in that made all the difference. So for everybody who feels like they're not understood, that they are alone in this, you're certainly not. And there are people who are ready to have these conversations with you who understand as best they can what you're going through. But it does take starting that conversation and being a little fearless. But I think it's something we can all aspire to do.
Definitely. Right. Owning our story is one of the bravest things we'll ever do, right? Brene Brown says that. And I just love that you speak to that as well. So we just want to thank you once again for being our guest here on Let's Talk Death, and for being such a wonderful advocate for suicide prevention and for making sure that it's really talked about in the young adult arena. I think that's really important. So thank you.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been our pleasure to have you on the show. I want to say to those listening that if you want to learn more about Heal Grief, you can visit us at healgrief.org. You can also learn more about Heal Grief's program Actively Moving Forward by visiting the website healgrief.org as well. And that is the specific program for young adults that's part of Heal Grief. It has a lot to do with the conversation that we've had today.
And Let's Talk Death episodes will air monthly, so make sure you sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for the link to next month's episode.
So thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.